Welcome everybody for the dinner session. I don't see any food being served to you, but I'm sure it's on its way. But that was a promise that was made, so I'm sure they will live up to it. Good evening and welcome to this session on the Shaping a New Ethos of Geopolitics and Geoeconomics, the Role of Emerging Powers in G20, BRICS, and IPSA. We have a fantastic panel with us. We are going to start right away. I just want to set the context of why I think here the organizers have chosen G20, BRICS, and IPSA as three very important multilateral forums to be discussed at this session. I think G20 as an idea and as a concept is not foreign to most of you in this room. It was a self-appointed but important club that called itself the Economic Steering Committee of the World. In its initial days, it was a critical joint response to the Western financial crisis. We refer to it in India also as the transatlantic financial crisis. A lot of seminal work was done on global benchmarks, on securities regulations, market, payment systems, and the like. In terms of how G20 has evolved, there are two very specific achievements that the G20 had, which goes unnoticed usually, especially in India. One is that it brought together cross-disciplinary issues. It wasn't that trade was left to the WTO and SDGs was left to the United Nations. There was global recognition that some of these issues that led to the global financial crisis have to be dealt with in a cross-disciplinary way. And so G20 became one of those forums where different multilateral organizations and standard-setting bodies came together to provide those solutions. The other is that G20 is often remarked as an institution or as a forum that is only an informal grouping. And sometimes, including here in India, its value is undermined because it's not obvious what its influence could be on the design of policy, especially in various governments. But very few recognize that it does have a lot of influence over standard-setting bodies, like the IOSCO, like the FSB, like the Bank of International Settlements, and they have done a lot of good joint work together. Of course, over time, as the financial crisis, as responses to the financial crisis came together from different countries, and the focus shifted from the financial market regulatory issues to more broader issues like jobs and climate change. G20 also received enough criticism that the agenda now has become too broad, maybe too broad for it to become effective. So I'd like the panel here to at least address that and see where do we stand and how do people assess that. BRICS, of course, is a very important forum for us here in India. Started about 10 years ago. In the beginning, the vision was to have an alternate financial architecture, at least an alternative system of governance, of global economic governance that can provide that alternative, which the Western-led system had so far not provided. In India, the strategic community was sold from day one and understood the benefits. The business community and the rest of the country were a little less sold. In some parts of Bombay, I can tell you that they still think of BRICS as a Goldman Sachs initiative, which we've taken too far. But under the presidency of India in 2016, over 100 meetings were held, and broad-based from tax to economic cooperation, to trade, to financial architecture, and progress was made in a lot of design-related issues between trade and financial cooperation, at least between the 5 countries. So of course, the question still remains, and also for this panel, is there still value in a grouping like this? And can a commodity giant like Russia, can a state-led China, can a market economy like India, can a commodity-dependent an exporter like Brazil, and of course, small services economy like South Africa, can they still come together into an effective forum? And last, of course, IPSA, which is also part of this dialogue today. IPSA started off as a forum of democracies, as a forum of market economies. there was a lot of promise on making United Nations reforms together, on bringing South-South cooperation together. And at least for India, it brought the idea of India and what India could do, at least in South America, because of Brazil that was participating in it. So I think I would like the panel to start off with some opening remarks. Please try and address what you think of these three forums, the value of G20, BRICS, and IPSA. And of course, I'll have some follow-up questions for you after. So, Gabriela, I'd like to start with you. Please, with your opening remarks. You have 3 to 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Askai, and thank you all for joining us in this very late time of the day. And thank you for my colleague panelist. I think you put the right question, because these forums are not operating in a vacuum. The 3 forums that you mentioned have evolved over time and are trying to address issues of concern of each one of them. But the reality is that the 3 forums are also underlying the fact that we need to go for multilateral solutions to the problems we're facing. You mentioned that it was a transatlantic crisis, or how you mentioned, trans-European or transatlantic. You know what, the first contribution of the G20, of course, was to bring the emerging economies to the table in recognition of the very important role that they play to find solutions to the global economy. But more than anything, it also proved that there is a level of interconnectedness in these economies that is pretty high. And I have to tell you, I live in France, and I remember European countries saying, oh, well, yes, how would you not expect this crisis to arrive? But this is an American crisis, because it's mortgage, people get higher debts than what they can pay, but it's an American crisis. Haven't they told you that all the banks were interlinked? So I think that this is the main issue that the G20 has shown. We hear a lot of criticism of, yes, the broader agenda, but you need to remember that these 3 settings are leaders' level settings. Therefore, you cannot ask leaders to discuss the regulatory framework of banks during 4 or 5 summits. They would always get the topics that they want to get, and leaders deal with the highest agenda of our economies and of the world. And therefore, you can neither say, oh, but you should not deal with political issues. They do, and I think they do in a very straightforward manner. I have to say that, yes, the G20 avoided the worst. You saw the stimulus packages. You see that, of course, the economy now is growing at higher rates and also in a more even manner. We're still not yet out of the woods. But there are some outcomes of the G20 that probably are not as noticeable, but that were as important as avoiding the worst on the financial crisis. This question of the anti-protectionist pledge, and to ask international institutions to monitor that protectionist measures are not going to be undertaken in the investment and trade world. I think this is very important. Now we are in a context where we are seeing mounting pressures on protectionism, mounting pressures of nationalist movements, and thinking that it's better to go inward or to deal with the issues by ourselves. But I think that the G20 showed that it was very important to have a common solution to the problems that we are facing. It also brought something that is relevant. It brought a common understanding of the problems that we're facing. And I have to say that it blurred these definitions of the north-south, east-west. No, it was really all these big economies with a common purpose to gather the strengths and to try to bring solutions to the global economic problems that we were facing. They deliver. I think they deliver in so many ways. I have to say, and I will refer to the 2 very important achievements that we contributed, the OECD contributed, because actually in the definition of the G20, they are also relying on international institutions. They did not invent another secretariat or another bureaucracy. they really rely on international institutions to deliver on their outcomes. And that's how we brought to the table the question of tax transparency and the fight against tax evasion and tax erosion, and that's one of the main deliverables of the G20. But there was another deliverable that probably people do not pay too much attention to it. But I can say, and Anil is here, we share those never-ending nights of negotiating communiques. But in the Chinese G20, we agreed to have a global forum on steel excess capacity. And I think this is something that probably you did not notice because there were so many other achievements. But this platform that we created for countries to discuss the policies and the actions taken that had led the world to this excess capacity in certain commodities really avoided another trade war. I have to say it, and I don't know if you agree, Anil, but it avoided a trade war. And this is one of the outcomes, and I think we need to keep on holding to that because we are also perceiving that there is this trend of having unilateral actions being taken in so many fronts. And I have to say that there is also an influence, and you might think that I'm too optimistic, but I saw it happening in the tables. Because it's not only about the formal agenda that you see being developed, that is very important. It's not only the topics that the presidencies put in the table, it's what happened behind. It's the common understanding that are being built. I saw so many times leaders getting together to discuss issues. I'm sure that not only the G20 at the leaders level, but I saw the Sherpas, I saw Anil, I saw many of the Sherpas working to deliver on the Bali Agreement on trade facilitation. Without the G20, I don't think that would have happened. Without the G20, to be frank, I don't think that we would have advanced on the climate dialogues that deliver on the climate agreement in Paris. And in so many ways, it builds up because these agendas are global and the G20 is global. So it couldn't deal with these issues without the impulse that we receive from the G20 and including on the SDGs. So fast forward these discussions, and let me tell you, one of the most interesting sessions I attended was the Russian Presidency. Because, of course, we advanced the formal issues on the trade, on the economy, on the structural issues, on the commitments of every country. But there was at the height of the Syrian crisis. And I remember that it was impossible to get countries together to discuss Syria. And I'm sure, I mean, this is a very difficult problem. It's intractable in many ways, and we're still facing a lot of the problems of the region. But the fact is that that summit, President Putin said, you know what? It's good to talk about the economic. It's good to talk about the tax or the trade or the, but I know that all of you want to talk about Syria, so we will talk about Syria. And all of us were like, oh my God, how are we gonna deal with it? Well, the fact is that they got together and they started talking about that. So I think it provides a setting with leaders can address this issue. The value is huge, it's immense. And the fact that you have a diverse group of countries getting together, I think it's a very important outcome of the global governance systems, and now we should preserve it.
Thank you very much, and especially thank you for staying within the time limit. Anil, you are the other government representative, so you go first. I mean, you go second, and then we get to the think tank scholars who are going to join us.
No, thank you, Akshay, for inviting us to be part of this very interesting topic that you have chosen. I'm happy to share the stage with Gabriela and my two colleagues as well. I think the question we need to ask ourselves, at least from a South African perspective and an African perspective, what value add does being a member of IPSA, G20, or BRICS bring to South Africa, and I would say the larger African continent? That's the perspective we see it from. And what value add does it bring to the global community, if anything at all? We have been speaking, I believe, in this forum as well since yesterday about a new emerging global order. Some of us believe that this order is upon us, and we're embracing it, while others are not too happy with what is happening in the changing of the guard, and you find a lot of resistance to this, and this comes with its own dynamic. Let me maybe start with IPSA and the coming together, as you mentioned, of 3 dynamic democracies from 3 different continents, sharing many common values, not only of democracy, good governance, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, but also the desire to share our experience in the development paradigm. And I think that, in a very quiet way, is something that is not known about IPSA, is the fund that we jointly launched, the IPSA Fund for Poverty and Hunger Alleviation. We have completed something like 27 projects where thousands of lives have been impacted through the various projects, and with a very small contribution of $1 million annually between the 3 countries, we've expended something like $33 million. And as I've said, in basic areas like water and sanitation, skills and capacity development, modernization of farming, and so forth, it's made a tremendous impact in LDCs, small island states, and other developing states in a very quiet way, working with the Office of South-South Cooperation. So sharing experience and setting out a new development model, a paradigm that moves quite significantly from the development assistance model that we have been used to in terms of North-South relations. And I think that's something we need to build on. What value does BRICS have for South Africa and the African continent? We were not one of the initial members. You know, Goldman Sachs, my view is Goldman Sachs took this idea from the '98 World Bank report that already identified the emergence of emerging market economies and the impact they're having on the global geopolitical, geoeconomic dynamic. And of course, you had the informal coming together, first of the 4 BRICS countries in the form of foreign ministers, and subsequently elevated to a summit. You've mentioned that you hosted something like 100 meetings during your presidency in 2016. Very dynamic presidency, very realistic. And you've had the accusation that you have within BRICS, that you see also in G20, that there's agenda creep. We originally set out to focus on the economic dimension of our cooperation, but economics cannot function within a vacuum. It functions within a political dimension. And whether we like it or not, the coming together of the BRICS was an important development, not just for the 5 BRICS countries, but also for the Global South. Because a number of the issues that we champion, of course, we do champion our common interest in the first instance, but we also do champion the interest of the developing South in shaping this new global dynamic that's emerging. And it's a reluctance that you see on the global stage of countries to embrace what is happening on the global geopolitical, geoeconomic space. No one wants to give up power. Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday spoke of that you negotiate from a point of power, that weakness is not respected. The coming together of the 5 BRICS countries was an important power block, creation of an important power block, like when the G7 was created in 1975. And for about 3 decades, they dominated the global scene because of the weakness, the current weakness of our multilateral system. And I must add that South Africa being part of any of these minilateral fora is precisely to underpin and strengthen multilateralism. We can't take away from that. That must still be the apex body in terms of where we decide policy and where we decide the direction the world must move in. But we see a paralysis, be it the Doha round within the WTO, be it the reform of the UNSC, 17, 18 years old, no movement, because no one wants to give up the high table and bring new players on board. And yet the global reality in terms of power dynamics, be it from a political perspective, be it from a financial perspective, be it from a trade and economic perspective, it's changing dramatically. I was reading the PricewaterhouseCoopers report that was released the past 2 weeks about the world in 2030. It's going to be a vastly changed world. The Africa of 1999 and the Africa of 2020 is vastly different. The Africa of 1999 made the headlines of The Economist, lost continent. The Africa of 2011, that same Economist magazine spoke of the emerging African lions. So Africa is changing dramatically. It can't be that this day and age that you have a continent of over 1.1 billion people, 55 countries, and no voice in the Security Council. That's an archaic reality we are still living with, and the reluctance to embrace an emerging Africa. We embrace an emerging Africa in terms of the opportunities this provides. It's a massive market, 1.7 billion by 2030. Everyone wants to be there. But the reality in terms of inclusion, and that's the other cliche we use very often, we speak of inclusive growth. We speak of inclusive growth, but what we are doing in reality, Africa's share of global trade is just over 2%. And that can't be the reality of the current world. And we have to make space when we speak of development that we embrace the African dimension as well. But G20, I want to say very quickly, I agree, Gabriela. It provides us a fantastic forum. Whether we like it or not, global agenda setting is happening in the G20. That is the reality. And whether we like it or not, we can be critical of agenda creep. Why should G20 deal with the issues of health or issues of food security? But it gives impetus and direction to what should happen in the appropriate multilateral bodies. Because you must also remember, it's not just 20 countries. You have all of the major multilateral international organizations that are an integral part and discussion of the G20 and contribute meaningfully together with all of the G20 member states in dealing with issues that should be dealt with in the respective multilateral institutions. But this gives impetus and energy and direction in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Actually, we do want to know whether we like it or not at some point in this discussion. Maybe we can have the think tank scholars tell us. Gustavo, you're coming from Argentina. You are president and managing director of one of the leading think tanks of Argentina. Argentina is the president of G20 in 2018. You've already launched your agenda. Please give us your opening remarks.
Thank you, Akshay. Hello, everybody. Enjoy your dinner. Okay, that is the moment when I ask myself why I am here. Okay, but okay, I'm here because Argentina is the president of G20, and we are an emerging country. So I think that the Argentine presidency is important for us because in many years in its history, Argentina will lay out priorities for presidents of emerging main countries. This is central for us because we can discuss these priorities, very important for emerging countries, in depth, or we hope that. This occasion gives us the opportunity to advance the international agenda and to find tools to make globalization fair. I think the rise of the G20 group as a high-level informal group for global economic decision-making to respond to the global financial crisis was or represented a practical example of the positive effect of increasing the participation of developing countries in policy-making decisions or processes. In spite of not having a permanent bureau, the G20 could become the nerve center of an expanding agenda that submitted proposals or draw them to international organizations to improve the international mechanisms. I think this has been patterned in Mexico in 2012, when there touches of topics very important for emerging countries were submitted, were covered. For example, food security, the social dimension of globalization, microcredits, or inclusive finance, employment, climate action, sustainable development, etc. However, in my opinion, the possibilities of intervention, proposals, or veto for countries like Argentina that are not part of the group of the main countries are still quite limited. Furthermore, I think that the role that could be played by the G20 to make sure the interests of our countries are protected is not still somehow uncertain, really. It's my belief that the representation and the role of the developing countries in the G20 must be a subject of debate, really. In this context, the strategy for our countries should consist of trying to tilt the balance from a peripheral place where the opinions among the main countries are contradictory to position themselves among the central countries so that they can discuss what they consider unfavorable or inadequate. Also, in terms of propositions, our country should make alliances with relevant partners to incorporate topics into the discussion agenda. And this dynamic can be useful to develop joint action strategies with countries such as the BRICS. But in order to identify the Argentine position as an emerging country in this multilateral sphere in the global governance and its influence as a middle power through its participation in G20, I could say that although Argentina has had very intense participation in previous summits during the former government, the Argentina's objectives didn't thrive in the G20 agenda, really, as did those of other emerging countries. And this was due to the fact that the former government failed to reinforce the position within the group by coordinating policies and actions with Brazil or Mexico, for example, which would have provided more political strength than isolation, really. But since December 2015, we have a new government, the government of Mauricio Macri, and this government has addressed the issues of the G20 in the current agenda in a way that emphasizes the continuing dialogue and to search the common issues or the common points by proposing priorities in which there is a common interest with our potential partners. By trying to make consensus a central pillar for Argentine presidency. Argentine presidency will not be only its own voice. It wants to be the voice of the whole region, bringing the aspirations and the concerns of Latin America and Caribbean, and as well as Africa and Asia. To finish, I would say that in connection with this, and that is the reason why Argentina had chose these three key issues, that those are futures work, infrastructure, and food security. Thank you.
No, I will get a chance, Gustavo, to ask you a little bit more about that specific agenda items. I want to come to Dawisson. You saw Anil make a really spirited case about South Africa, because South Africa is common for G20, IPSA, and BRICS. Dawisson, you're representing Brazil here, at least Brazil's voice. What do you think? Your opening remarks, please.
Okay, good evening. I'm happy to be joining Raisina Dialogue for the second year. Last time, still a Raisina young fellow, and this year, at least in the eyes of the organizers, as a grown-up. That's good, and I'm happy for that. I'll try to expose some views on the process, but maybe not from a Brazilian or a governmental perspective, not necessarily, but I'll try to deliver some contents on a more independent basis, as much as I can. And if you allow me to, I would take a more abstract and maybe professorial road in order to adequately tackle the issues that are before us. Whenever I join this kind of forum, I make it a rule not to contemplate many different issues. Sorry. I make it a choice not to try to cover many different aspects, but instead I focus on one and only one argument. And this time I'll make the case for middle powers like Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and South Africa to learn something from India, from the Indian experience over the last 25 years or so. And for some very obvious reasons. First of all, because India is outperforming in every field, economically, diplomatically, I'd say even militarily. If you take as a proxy indicator the topics being chosen by IR students, both at undergrad and graduate levels in US academia, you will definitely come across references to India as the power to be. I believe that's a good proxy indicator for the world to come, because if you look back some 10 or 15 years ago, China was occupying this place. One second reason for us to pay attention to New Delhi, to pay attention to India, is the way India has transformed what some people and some countries see as a liability into an asset. And I'm referring to democracy. The way, a very adroit, very deft way, India has been maneuvering in this global governance, in this globalization 3 or 4, I think it's remarkable. The way India, while catering to its people's needs, it projects, not in unison, but it projects the weight of its huge, enormous constituency. And in this regard, I mean, Brazil is a big democracy from the global south as well. Indonesia, Mexico, and the like, they should find ways to explore this feature and to profit from this characteristic, because, again, it's an asset. And referring to the title of this session, Shaping a New Ethos of Geopolitics and Geoeconomics, I think democracy should be included in whichever format we follow in the future. So our countries have a role to play. I'm very much convinced about it. And third, and maybe most importantly, I believe India has been able to escape what the literature calls the tragedy of middle power politics. And what is it? Traditionally, middle powers tend to abide by the rules, tend to incorporate the norms, the institutions, And while doing so, they might even get some short-term rewards, but they end up wearing a straitjacket. They lose autonomy. So if they run their foreign policies in accordance with the major powers playbook, they won't ever speak by themselves. But on the other hand, if you try to revise the world order, you might get punished, both symbolically and materially. I still remember when Brazil, along with Turkey and Iran, they have reached an agreement on Tehran's nuclear program after being openly encouraged by US President Barack Obama, then US President Obama. But by the time they announced, by the time the parties announced they were signing the agreement, then US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton totally unauthorized at the level of the United Nations Security Council this so-called Tehran Declaration, Tehran Agreement was pulled down, and I think it reflects to a large extent the way great powers tend to block and make emerging nations' lives difficult. I mean, I think it gives a good metaphor. It tells a lot about our efforts to sit at the high table and how they might be recurrently blocked. So I believe India has been successful in a sense, in both gently revising or gently bidding for some revision at the systemic level while negotiating its entrance into this condominium of powers. So I think to the extent that India proves able to cope with or to come to terms with some of its human rights issues, India is a good role model for this proposal of shaping a new ethos for geopolitics and geoeconomics.
Thank you very much. I think as the only Indian rep on this dais, I'm happy to take all those credit on behalf of the country. I'm almost getting excited. I feel like I want to respond to you and say, but as the moderator, I should control myself and actually give the floor to the experts. But first, back to Gabriela and Anil. A lot of the work that has gone into G20, especially the initial work that happened on coming up with new rules for the energy and financial benchmarks, the regulatory principles, the tax information code, the code for capital movement, all these new rules and standards that the G20 put in place. A lot of that, Gabriela, came from OECD. At least the initial thinking, the concept notes came from OECD. Anil, are the emerging markets doing enough to contribute to the decision-making into the design of these policies? Are the policies reflective of the characteristics? And Gabriela, have you seen inputs from emerging countries, and what are some of the examples where having the emerging countries and the developing countries on the table, in the decision room, in the engine room, has made a difference? So if you can both speak to that. You go first.
You know, I think that you are falling into this framing of the questions of the North-South. I think that
that's the panel. It's not me.
No. But the specific question of your asking us whether the emerging economies have contributed or not. Yes. I think that the fact that we are discussing these standards in the G20 format with a very diverse group of countries that are in a very different development scale, will bring very different perspectives. And it does by just bringing a table that is in a different shape. Let me tell you on the question of taxes, because this is one of the contributions of the OECD. Could not be that the standards that the OECD has developed within its membership, that is mainly of advanced economies, although I'm Mexican, so we also have emerging economies within our remit. And actually Brazil and Argentina are asking for membership of the OECD. We have been working with trying to advance this question of exchange of information, of tax information, for 10 years. And we did not get to square one. Not because India or Brazil or South Africa will not share the view that we should avoid this waste and the governments losing their tax revenues, but because many countries in the OECD, advanced economies, have benefited from that regime. We went over and over again. What happened? What was the difference when the G20 came about? Well, first of all, the countries needed the money. Second, you had a much more positive environment for the countries around the table, including the emerging economies, to look at these issues. And I think there were many contributions that the emerging economies did in terms of really trying to look at how these standards were being developed in a way that will help them to address the issues that they were looking after. And in some ways, I think that this division between North and South started to be blurred because some advanced economies and emerging economies were put in the very same basket, trying to address these issues, trying to address the question of base erosion, trying to address the question of tax evasion and tax avoidance. But they did something else. And this is relevant for the moment we are living, and this is the reflection that I want to leave because we should not take it for granted. All of these countries agreed on a rules-based international economy, and this is very important. They agreed to abide by the rules. They agreed to come together, define some standards, not only on taxes. They also did it for corporate governance. They did it for the financial rules. But trying to also take into account the fact that, of course, the financial markets are different in the emerging economies than in the advanced economies. But the fact is that all of them are really agreeing on abiding by the rules. And I think that this sentiment that was created by the G20, and by, I have to say, the OECD was honored to be working in the G20, even though we have many countries that were not our members, but it gave a conduit by which some of the standards that we were developed, the countries around the table, they said, we don't care if this was developed by X or Y. Mm-hmm. These are very good inputs. We take them, we change them, we frame them, but we are looking to have a rules-based economy. I think that we are risking that. We're risking that. This understanding of continuing to build up on multilateral solutions is being put into question, particularly by more advanced economies. I have to say that what is very interesting now, and this is a role for the emerging economies going forward, more than what we look in the back and how they have contributed, is very interesting to see that at the moment where there is increased protectionism in some of the advanced economies in the G20, the voices that are saying, no, globalization is not that bad, interconnectedness is not that bad, keep markets open, keep trade regimes and investment regime open, is the emerging economies. So I think they have a role to play, to try to continue engaging with the advanced economies that are looking inward and to try to preserve what we have achieved through these years, because it's not that we are comfortably thinking that the G20 has just delivered and we're fine. It's not. Yes, the global economy is growing at 3.5%. Yes, growth is widespread in all the G20 countries, which has not been the case in the last decade. You have ups and downs. Sometimes it was emerging economies, sometimes it was some other economies. Now it's even. But we're facing very great risk of protectionism, risk of unilateralism. We're facing risk also in terms of the solidity of that growth. We know the level of corporate debt, particularly in emerging economies, or public debt in the advanced economies, the shadow banking, the fact that we still need to get out of the very non-conventional policy measures that were taken, particularly by central banks. So there are lots of challenges, but the willingness to address them together in a multilateral platform, I think, needs to be preserved. The OECD has benefited greatly from engaging with the G20 because we have put to test many of the standards that we have developed on anti-corruption on many fields, and we have listened to the emerging economies, which actually has also very interesting points regarding, even if you say that is a cliche, the inclusive growth, Anil, we have not yet achieved it. Inequalities are mounting in all of these countries, and this is something that we need to bring together because we need to make it count for people.
And of course, you gave the example of tax, because tax and the code for tax that the G20 has now adopted, is one of those which has gone from concept to actual implementation down to every single country adopting it. So it's an example that G20 has done, regardless of where the original idea came from. So in that sense, it's an appropriate example for you to take. Anil.
No, thank you. That's a very interesting and, in a sense, provocative question. Because I think if there's a perception that the EME countries within the G20 are docile and being dominated by the thinking of the developed countries, that's total misnomer. I think when you talk of contestation of power, this is where it's happening. It's happening here in the G20. It is robust, it is vibrant, and it can become very rough, as Gabriela mentioned when we negotiate the summit document. So eventually, we do agree, and we agree on a number of policy positions that we all adopt. But it is by consensus. Nothing is forced upon us. I can't see any EME country compromising the national position that will undermine positions that advance domestic interest. You have the freedom to talk. But I think what is important is that you don't see cohesion just amongst developed countries. You see divisions there as well. Climate change was a typical example at the Hamburg summit. But you saw the coming together of the rest of us to safeguard the gains we made at the Paris Agreement and to ensure that we stick by the implementation targets we set for ourselves. Likewise, be it on the financial or economic, on the WTO, we have vast divergences on some of the key issues. Those that are in the Doha round are sometimes, some countries try to sneak those areas where we have contestation as developing countries into the G20 agenda, thinking it would work there. But it doesn't. So I think what is important, we do have, as EME countries, our own meeting prior to every Sherpa meeting, and likewise the finance track, to try and coordinate positions so that we go there in a position of strength. And I'm sure, likewise, the developed countries, as part of the G20, adopt the same posture. So there is contestation. But I think the important thing is that we can speak very frankly, despite the divergence of views, and try and find convergence and flexibility in positions for the good, not just of the group, for the good of the global community. Because G20 cannot survive in itself. G20 is not just about the G20. As I've said, global agenda setting is happening in this fora by default in many cases. But as South Africa and as an African country, we will jealously safeguard the interest of not only our national interest, but the interest of the African continent, because that is part ingrained in our foreign policy, that we not only advance our national interest, but we advance the interest of the African continent. Be it in IPSA, be it in BRICS, be it in G20. That's our national position. And I think all countries are likewise informed by that approach. But I think we don't have a better platform at the present time, given what I said earlier on about the global multilateral system and its current weakness. The G20 provides you that platform where you have dynamic emerging market economies, established developed country economies, sitting and grappling with some of the key, as I said, not just the economic and financial challenges, trade challenges, but some of the major geopolitical challenges. Gabriela referred to the St. Petersburg summit and the issue of Syria. I can assure you, I was there in St. Petersburg. If it wasn't for President Putin introducing that topic there, you probably would have had Syria being bombed by a certain number of countries that had agreed they had transgressed a red line and we need to take action. It was a G20 discussion there in a very open manner that changed the trajectory and perhaps averted a greater polarization of global forces. So I think it's a healthy interaction that's taking place, and I think that's the dynamic of the G20. Thank you.
Gustavo, you mentioned that Argentina has now put its own agenda for 2018. G20, as most of you already know, is a rotating presidency. There is continuity in the agenda, thanks to the bureaucrats who are sitting here who try to maintain it as such. But of course, every country that takes on the presidency also gets a chance to sharpen the agenda, to at least to include or present topics of interest or importance to that particular country. So in this case, Argentina in 2018 has put food security and the future of work amongst all the other things that are also on the agenda, trade, financial regulation, infrastructure financing. But what stands out is food security and future of work. Not that it has not been discussed before, but as a main agenda item. Why do you think that is?
Okay, thank you for asking me this, because I was going to talk about this in my previous presentation, but I thought that my time came over. So, okay, why the future of work? Our government focused this topic in a direct connection with the technology, the impact of technology, and the role of education on this. Because as you know, the technology has led the development of the new form of work that is very useful for everybody, but at the same time, I'm changing very rapidly the production practices. This has an impact on the social protection, employment agenda, and education. And I think, this is my personal opinion, that the education is should be the heart of the debate, because education empowers people to improve and to build their own future. So I think it's very important. I think it's some people say that it's a light agenda. I think it's the base agenda. And education for people, jobs, and food security. Why food security? Because the 70% of the countries in the G20 group has almost the 80% of lands to produce food. So that is very important. But for me, the most important thing is to discuss what is happening with, for example, the soil erosion, because reducing the available areas to produce food is crucial for countries, for developing countries that has food insecurity, for example. So I think we must take advantage to this Argentine presidency to develop this these topics, to put these topics on the agenda. So,
actually, food security and agriculture would be, of course, very important to India. I'm sure India would like to contribute to that agenda. And future of work, which is also a way of encapsulating all the jobless growth that is taking place. Again, future of jobs and what kind of jobs we can produce, a very important agenda item both for developing and developed countries. So I'm sure that both of them will be well received.
I see that people, when speak about the future of work, think that in 15, I don't know, maybe 1,000 years or 100 years, but it's now. That is happening now.
Yeah. Understood. Dawson, I'd like to pose you a question, but I'd like Gabriela and Anil to chime in also later. G20, BRICS, even IPSA to some extent started off with a geo-economic impetus, to talk about the international financial system, international economic architecture. But of course, they took on some geopolitical objectives as well, and it worked really well, it seems. You have mentioned it, Gabriela, that when the leaders are getting together, they're political leaders, and if there's something that is important, they will discuss it. IPSA has also, like the heads of government of IPSA countries had also gone and spoken with the Syrian President Assad in 2013 to try and find a solution. BRICS, NSA, the National Security Advisors meeting has become very important, became very important when the India and China were having some border issues. So Dawson, and is this a natural evolution for these forums to take on a geopolitical objective, and maybe that's fine, or you don't agree with it?
Okay, my take. You won't hear it from a Brazilian official, but the impression that I get at the moment is that this incumbent government is not really interested in the BRICS grouping per se, nor in IPSA, maybe G20. Brazil now seems to be much more interested in acceding to OECD. That's the platform. That's the main economic goal of this government. And the BRICS grouping can be a useful tool for Brazilians, especially Brazilian businesses, to enter both Chinese and Indian markets. I mean, that's my impression. So BRICS has become sort of a pathway to India and China, a shortcut to India and China. And the geopolitics of it is lost at the moment. Over the last 2 years, Brazil has kind of changed in a dramatic way, I'd say, its policy towards the Global South initiatives. We are holding elections in October, later this year. So in 2019, things might change again. At least that's what I hope. And we might come back to this track, and again, we might put all our hopes and expectations in Southern initiatives, but not at the moment. It's not what's happening in Brazil right now.
Gabriela and Anil, if I remember correctly, during the Turkish G20 summit, there was a bomb blast that took place in Turkey, I think the day before, so that at least the agenda, at least in terms of the leaders' summit and what went in the media was hijacked, and a lot of this discussion took place on terrorism. So terrorism, refugee, Syria, as you've mentioned it, are all becoming part of these discussions. So a natural evolution, or we need to come back to the original mandate and focus on the pending issues that we still need to do, the pending reforms that we still have on our plate.
Whether the G20 is going to become a geopolitical body, I doubt it. I doubt it because the structure that has been developed to not have the people in charge of those topics. How far you can distinguish the economic impact of certain phenomena is very complex. And therefore, I can understand how in Germany, one of the most interesting conversations that leaders had, that actually the Sherpas did not develop as we develop until the minor detail, was terrorism financing. Migration was also introduced by Turkey, but Germany, of course, with this very great crisis that Europe had been facing in terms of the flows of migrants, it has an impact, and of course, leaders wanted to talk about it, and they put it together, and actually they also asked us to put the figures and the flows. And so what I'm saying is that being a leaders group, you can always use the fact that leaders are going to meet, and it's great. And I think that's a very interesting part of the G20, because they can always come and discuss the issues of the day. You don't need to put it in the agenda. You don't need to, because there is the formal part of the agenda setting, which Anil referred to, that is, okay, we discuss, the presidency makes some proposals, everybody talks about it, the Sherpas get together and the finance ministers get together to advance the different topics that are really core to the G20 on the economic field, in terms of the digital revolution, in terms of the climate and growth. We work on that topic in the German presidency, in terms of the financial markets, in terms of the economic performance. But the point is that it's very difficult to distinguish the impact of certain topics in the economic agenda. And as long as there is an impact, I'm sure that leaders would want to put it together. And you know, the beauty of it is that it's really leaders level. You see the leaders, you see President Macri was the one who said, okay, I'm really into food security. Who's gonna tell them no? This is not we don't think this is useful, we don't think. We try to see how to accommodate. It's also a presidential body. It's really driven by the presidency. The organizations, we work with the presidency and we put the issues in. Of course, then other countries need to agree, and then the consensus negotiations need to be put forward. But the reality is that the leaders' drive is what brings relevant topics to the table. And common understandings, which is also something that we need to underline. The fact that now everybody is having a common understanding of the challenges of the digital economy started with China. Germany put the blueprint on digitalization, and I think it will continue. Discussing how do we address the question of climate, not the goals, because the goal is negotiated somewhere else, or trade is negotiated somewhere else. But you have this fantastic group that can look at the issues and that can try also to give an impulse to what is happening in other settings. I would be less concerned, you know, I'm not so into this question of, oh my God, you're encroaching and what's restrict the agenda, don't go with these. No, yeah, you need to be careful not to overdo it. You need to keep the core. But the reality is that the world is so complex. I would not put so many frameworks and so many rules into how you develop the agenda. I would leave it to the presidency, and as far as the presidency can show the value of addressing certain issues and the rest of the members are willing to go for it, I think it's important, it's relevant.
You know, I think in this day and age, to compartmentalize issues into geopolitics, geoeconomics, it just doesn't work. It's not the reality of what's happening in the global community today. Even when you're sitting in the WTO negotiating positions, it's from an informed political position. You are politicking there. You're not just dealing with trade issues. You are informed from a national position, you are informed from a regional position. So it's inevitable, and I think to compartmentalize what is happening in the economic trade space as not functioning within a political umbrella, then we are really out of sync of what the reality is. when you sit in negotiations, be it the trade negotiations, be it climate change. Climate change is about politics because it impacts. I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke yesterday of the 4 pillars. He started off with security. And, I mean, we have the same challenge in terms of security, in terms of the impact of global terrorism on the economy, on development, on all dimensions of life. But we deal with it from a political security perspective, and it has an impact on our trade, it has an impact on our economic growth, it has an impact on all of our areas of life, our own personal security, so forth and so forth. So I think that while the G20, and you see the same in the BRICS, you mentioned the national security advisors, they have taken a very prominent position in the agenda of BRICS countries. They report directly also the outcome of the deliberations to the leaders as of last year, and it's going to continue henceforth. It's because of the security dimension, cybersecurity as a real threat to all dimensions of state is there. So I think one has to look at the reality of the world today and the interdependence amongst the various issues and how they coexist. It will be difficult to separate and compartmentalize them as strictly financial, strictly trade, strictly economic, strictly development. Development comes with its own political dimension. When I sit in the development committee of the G20, South Africa is a permanent co-chair there. It's not just about development, it's also about posturing and putting positions forward that's in the interest of the South. That may not go down very well with others, but that's the position I have to defend and push in terms of my national interest, in terms of African interest, in terms of interest of the South. So I think it would be difficult to compartmentalize.
Thank you very much. I do have 1 or 2 more questions, but I think this is the right time to turn to the floor and see if people have questions. I don't know if they're holding you hostage for dessert. I was told that they would not give you dessert until we moved into Q&A, but we'll move regardless. I see 3 hands already, but I don't know if the hands is going to work. I think you'll have to still move to the mic. So yes, please, you can use the next mic. And
good evening. I'm Georg Telerea, Director of Russian National Committee on BRICS Studies. And my question goes to Ambassador Sooklal. Well, given the difficulties now that Brazil experiences, which was mentioned before that, and also after a very, fruitful Chinese chairmanships, what are the South Africa's priorities in chairmanship this year? We're very much interested in that, and so I think everybody else does. Thank you.
Maybe can we get 3 questions, or at least 3 to 4 questions at a time, please? Then we can just have the people answer.
My question is also to the ambassador. My name is Madalitso Piri.
Please come closer to the mic. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, given the fact that, I want to, it's a quick one. The issue of a liberal-based international order can somehow be a myth, especially for countries in the South. They developed their own institutions that evolved, but at the very same time, it seems to me that for other interests to be promoted within the IPS and the BRICS partnerships, parallel institutions need to be built that do not purport the same ideals. I just want your thoughts around that. What kind of order do you foresee in terms of institution building?
Who's that question for?
To Sooklal.
Anil? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm Kazem Sajjadpur from Iran. I enjoyed the panel and thank everybody. I have one general question for the panel and one specific one. The general one is, there is an argument that this whole G20 and forums like that, not BRICS, are taking out the centrality of United Nations system to some exclusive clubs And this is at the expense of developing countries, especially those who cannot relate, to this big powers game. So I hope the panel will elaborate on this question. The second question is for our colleagues from Brazil. You talked about, rightly, about the tragedy of middle powers. I want to elaborate, and you mean there is a limitation for middle powers to act globally within the regulation laws? And can you elaborate also in the internal grouping in G20? Is this, let's say, middle powers a group, a small states a group, other group, or so on and so forth? Thank you.
Thank you. Next, please. The last one for this round.
I'm Krozalewski. I'm from Poland, and I work for a think tank called Poland Asia Study Center. And my question goes it's about G20, because this organization or this format was designed not only to represent the given 20 states, but also underrepresented regions. And therefore, the question, do you represent the regions and not only the nation states? And if so, I would like Mr. Sooklal, Mr. Martinez, and Mr. Lopes to just briefly let us understand how you organize this, let's say, regional, let's say, consultation process.
Thank you.
Like South Africa for Africa and you for the South America.
Thank you. Anil, why don't you, since some of the questions are directed at you directly.
Thank you, Prof. Trulaya. Very quickly, the key objectives we've set for our presidency, firstly, to build on past decisions taken and look at implementation. I think that's very important. When South Africa hosts the summit in July this year, it'll be the 10th summit. So we want to also have a reflection, a retreat amongst leaders to reflect on what have we achieved. Are we on track in terms of what we set out for BRICS to be, and to perhaps give us some guidance in terms of the next decade or so. Secondly, South Africa would like to establish a peacekeeping working track under its presidency. Given the importance of peacekeeping, all BRICS countries are major peacekeeping contributing countries, and given what is happening within the UNDP-KO, especially diminishing budget, and yet we have the issues as a major challenge. Secondly, we don't have a women and gender stream like you have the W20 and the G20. We want to have a dedicated work stream on women and gender, and also there's a proposal by Russia to look at the Women's Business Council, so we want to absorb that into that structure. Thirdly, we want to look at establishing, BRICS is also about looking at institution building. We want to look at initially establishing a virtual vaccine center that speaks to the needs of Africa and the global south. And fourthly, the challenge of the fourth industrial revolution, both in terms of opportunities and challenges, and how BRICS countries can work together in addressing these. These are the four strategic objectives, and of course we will continue with the outreach with the global south, both with Africa and the idea that China brought forward last year, the BRICS Plus. So it will be a collection of countries of the south and the African leadership, like we did during our chairship in 2013. Or the new institution building, I think, let me speak first from an African perspective. I think we have done very well. The transition that we had in 2002 from the OAU to the AU with the new Constitutive Act that is very clear what we want to achieve, thereafter evolving NEPAD, the African peer review mechanism, and more recently in 2013 when we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the OAU-AU Agenda 2063 and its first 10-year plan. Of course, there is still a tendency, and you saw this on the global scene recently, on the way Africa is treated. But as I've said, there are many fault lines in Africa today. We are far more peaceful, we have far more democracies, far more stability and growth in Africa than we had about 20 or 30 years ago. There are still major fault lines which we, as Africans, have to first and foremost address and find solutions to, and not depend on the outside world. But we can't do everything by ourselves, and therefore the partnerships that we have. Now, South Africa is part of the G20, and as I said, it is part of our foreign policy. We don't represent the African continent. We never say that. We don't have a mandate. But as entrenched in our foreign policy, we have 5 pillars in our foreign policy. The first pillar is advancing regional integration, and the second is advancing the African agenda. So it's very much part of our foreign policy that we do so. Within BRICS, we have an African mandate. When we came here to Delhi in 2012, the leaders of Africa, in the form of the chair of the African Union Commission, the chair of the African Union, as well as the chair of NEPAD, wrote to President Zuma to say, when you're coming to BRICS, please champion the development needs of Africa. And we do report to the African Union Summit in terms of what we are doing. So there is an African mandate in terms of what we do within the BRICS, and that's why you find this. You have 2 observers. You have the African Union as an observer, and you have the chair of NEPAD as an observer in the G20. We work very closely together. Even though they're observers, South Africa consult closely with the chair as well as the NEPAD chair in terms of the positions we take within the G20. So I think institution building must start within the continent itself and take advantage of the global formations that are there. Thirdly, G20, removing from the centrality of the UN system. Yes, I said this at the very outset. For South Africa, being part of the G20 is about reinforcing and re-energizing the multilateral system. There can't be any substitute for the global multilateral institutions. They are our institutions. They are as strong as we make them. They are weak as we want them to be. And I believe the G20 doesn't take away from that. The reality is, you have a G20, you can't wish it away. You have a BRICS, you can't wish it away. You have a G7, you can't wish it away. But we have to work with these formations in order to ensure that we strengthen the global systems of governance. It shouldn't be there to undermine and detract from them. It should be complementary to them. With regard to G20 representation, I think I've covered that. When the global financial crisis of 97, 98 came about and G20 finance ministers came together, it was this collective of 20 countries. And following the financial crisis of 27, 28, it was elevated to a summit-level meeting. And I think for the global South, that was a very important development, because it brought together the global South, the developed world, into one configuration. And the G20 can't be just about the G20 countries. It has to be about the global community. If we think that we can sit there in a cozy club and take decisions that will just benefit the 20 of us, we're living in a dream. And you saw the protests that was there in Hamburg last year. And that's a clear message to us that we need to ensure that we need to listen to the people. We need to be attuned to what the people are saying. There's a saying that, remember the people. If you don't remember the people won't remember you. And I think it's very important that whatever we do, it's always a people-centered agenda that we are advancing. Thank you.
Gabriela?
I have to say that I have spent so many meetings together with Anil, and I agree with him. Thank you. No. Now let me just pick up the part of the question where I think it's relevant to this issue. You mentioned Ashki at the beginning. You said self-appointed group of countries, but I have to say that it's true. It's completely true. I agree, because it was these countries who decided that they needed to get together to address the question of the crisis. But I think that whatever the G20 does will benefit the world. It's 85% of the global economy. So I would turn it around. Instead of saying the G20 is taking away the centrality of the United Nations, I would say no. Let's use this platform that is so powerful by just the composition of the countries that they have to advance other agendas. And I think that's what is happening, or what has happened up to now. I don't think, frankly, that the climate deal in Paris would have been achieved if you did not have the G20 countries working together for 10 years advancing this agenda. And you remember, Anil, from the very beginning, this topic was not even put at the table, because every time anybody would want to put climate change at the table, some of the countries around the table would say, no way, there is other place to, and we are not going to discuss it now. The fact is that they discuss it. Not formally, they did not agree to 2% degrees or to commit to anything, because it's true, it's being negotiated by some other forum. But the fact is that they discuss it. And you see how much countries have been moving and how much they put together an idea that really deliver on some other areas. If the centrality of the United Nations system would have been taken away by the G20, why did we achieve the SDGs 2 years ago? I mean, it's one of the most meaningful agreements that we have arrived. And it was the United Nations. And you know who determines the development agenda in the G20 now? The SDGs. So
I was just going to say that there is now a criticism of G20 taking on the SDGs as an agenda, and G20 agenda has broadened too much. So you're absolutely right.
No, it's not. It's not the
but
question.
It's mutually reinforcing.
What I want to leave with the public and with my colleagues is that the international system is dynamic. It's the same countries. It's the same South Africa that is sitting in the G20 that is sitting in the United Nations. It's the same Mexico that is sitting there and goes and talks in the WTO. And so the fact is that the reality is that if you find a way to build confidence and to build trust among countries, which is one of the outcomes that I feel has delivered for the G20, you might find ways to reach compromises, not in an easy manner, because it's very complex. And I agree with Anil. You sit there in the G20 and sometimes you're like, oh no, my God, again, no? Listen to these positions that are fighting. But at the end, I think it helped to bring the things together. The question of representation, I don't think the G20 is trying to represent anybody, even with the presence of the regional organizations, which I think is a way to try to fill the legitimacy gap in terms of bringing all the voices together. I think they are very honest in the sense that they are not representing anybody. But the fact is that they are too important to be ignored, and too important not to give them a chance to deliver for the world economy.
Thank you very much. Most of the questions were directed to both of you, but do you have any final comments, Gustavo or Dawisson, before I close this?
Sorry?
Do you have any final comments before I close this, Dawisson?
Very quickly, the middle power politics issue. Well, I'd say middle powers, they face an existential dilemma. Traditional middle powers, and I could cite Nordic countries, the Netherlands, Australia, Canada, those are traditional middle powers according to the literature. They, after Second World War, they have helped erecting a world order, so they come to defense of this so-called liberal world order, and they have been in a way rewarded for being allies with the United States, with Western powers. And but what I am saying, in according to the literature, is that there is a price in the long run. I mean, a collateral effect is that they might lose some maneuverability. They might lose some autonomy in their foreign policies. And on the other hand, emerging middle powers, and Iran gives a good case study. They might get punished harshly when they try to revise, when they have a revisionist stance. And that happens to many other countries. And that's why I'm telling India has been dealing with it in a beautiful way.
Well, I think that this is the right message to give at the right forum. With that, please join me in thanking the panel. Have this